This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment and artistic purposes. All characters, events, and institutions depicted are entirely fictional and bear no resemblance to real persons or actual events. She had loved him in silence for 3 years, and he repaid her with public ruin. Lady Saraphina Vale stood in the great hall of the royal court, every eye in the kingdom trained on her face, and she did not flinch. Not once. That was the thing they never understood about her. She had been forged in silence, in ledgers and loss, in the long nights after her grandfather died and left her nothing but debt and a name. They thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. Stay with me until the end of this story. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from. The morning it happened, the frost had not yet lifted from the stone courtyard of Thornwall Palace. Saraphina Vale arrived the way she always arrived. Early, quiet, dressed in a gown the color of deep water, her dark hair pinned without ornament, her face composed into the careful stillness she had learned to wear the way other women learned to smile. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men mid-sentence. She was the other kind of beautiful, the kind that took time to see, that built quietly in the memory until a man found himself thinking of her face at odd hours and not knowing why. She had never traded on it. That had always been her mistake, or so she would think later, walking back through the ruins of the morning. She had believed that what existed between herself and Damian Blackthorne was something more durable than beauty. 3 years of arranged engagement, 3 years of careful conversation, of letters she had written, and letters he had answered with surprising frankness, of evenings in his library where he had paced and talked about the pressures of managing the Blackthorne estates. And she had listened, actually listened, not with the glazed performance of a woman waiting for her turn to speak, but with the focused attention of someone who understood finance and understood men, and understood that the two were rarely as separate as either pretended. She had thought he knew that about her. She had thought he valued it. The great hall of Thornwall Palace held perhaps 300 people on a formal morning, and this was a formal morning, the quarterly gathering of the kingdom's high houses, the merchant lords who had risen to social adjacency with the aristocracy, the ministers and secretaries and hangers-on who made up the court's permanent population. The chandeliers threw gold light across faces that Saraphina had catalogued over years, who owed debts to whom, who had quietly purchased controlling interests in which shipping concerns, who was 3 bad harvests away from catastrophe and trying to hide it behind fresh lace. She took her position at the edge of the room where the Blackthorne household typically assembled before the Duke's formal entrance. Lord Pemberton Ashe, Damian's chancellor, gave her a short nod. He was a lean, gray-templed man with the kind of face that gave away nothing, which was why she had never fully trusted him. Lady Morrow, one of the court's fixtures, touched Seraphina's arm briefly in greeting and moved away. The room was warm with bodies and the particular tension of people performing ease. Then Damian entered, and the air changed. He was tall. She had always registered that first, the physical fact of him, the width of his shoulders and the formal black coat, the way he moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed to calculate whether he was welcome somewhere. His dark hair was shorter than she remembered from their last meeting 2 weeks prior, and he was freshly shaved, and he looked, she would later acknowledge to herself with something cold in her chest, magnificent. He entered with Lady Celeste Ashcroft on his arm. Seraphina's body registered it before her mind did, a kind of stillness dropping over her like cold water, the way the body understands a blow before the mind names it. She watched him cross the threshold with Celeste Ashcroft pressed close to his side, and she watched the way Celeste laughed at something he murmured, and she watched the way his hand covered Celeste's on his arm, and the watching was the worst part. The watching was the part she could not stop. Celeste Ashcroft was everything the word magnificent was invented for. Golden hair arranged in elaborate coils, a gown of cream silk that caught the chandelier light like something lit from within, cheekbones so precisely sculpted they seemed architectural. She was the kind of woman men wrote terrible poetry about. She was the kind of woman who had always known it. Saraphina stood very still at the edge of the room and understood, in the space of a single breath, that the letter she had written to Damian last week, The careful letter about the Harwick trade route restructuring she had been working on, the numbers she had spent 2 nights checking, the plan she had wanted to discuss with him before the quarterly gathering, would not be answered, not with the answer she had written it for. She understood something else, too, something deeper and colder. The thing between herself and Damian that she had been quietly building in her mind, the thing she had allowed herself to trust, even when she knew better than to trust anything. She would need to put it down now. She would need to put it down without ceremony, without asking for an explanation, because asking for an explanation would require making her hurt visible, and she did not make things visible. She was gathering herself for the performance of normalcy. The right face, the right posture, the specific dignity of a woman who had seen nothing unusual. When Damian's eyes found her across the room, he held her gaze for 3 seconds. Not long. Long enough. Then he said something to Celeste, and Celeste laughed again, and the two of them began moving in her direction. Saraphina breathed once, slowly, through her nose. She had faced worse. She had sat across from bankers who were trying to ruin her and smiled while she quietly dismantled them. She had negotiated with men who believed she had no leverage and discovered otherwise. This was a formal morning gathering, and she was a woman with good posture and 3 years of practice at composure. And whatever happened next, she would not give the room anything worth talking about. Lady Saraphina, Damian's voice was formal. Not cold, worse than cold, neutral, the way a man was neutral with someone he had already finished with. I'm glad you're here this morning. There is something that needs to be addressed. She looked at him directly. She had always been able to look at him directly. Your Grace, Lady Celeste and I will be announcing our formal courtship this morning. Before that announcement, I thought it right to speak with you in person regarding our prior arrangement. He paused. The pause was not cruelty. It was worse than cruelty. It was efficiency. The engagement will be formally dissolved. I have had the papers drawn. You'll receive your copy through the appropriate channels. The room had gone quiet around them. Not silent. People were still moving, still murmuring. But the particular quiet that gathered around a scene, the held-breath attention of 300 people suddenly aware that something worth watching was happening. Seraphina's hands were folded in front of her, her nails pressed briefly into her own palm. She did not show it. I see, she said. There is no ill will intended, he continued, and she recognized the tone. It was the tone he used in negotiations, the careful measured voice of a man constructing a record of reasonableness. Our arrangement was made under circumstances that have since changed. You are an intelligent woman. I believe you understand that engagements of this nature serve strategic purposes, and when those purposes are better fulfilled by a different arrangement, you don't need to explain it. Her voice was level. I understand strategic arrangements, Your Grace. I have managed them my entire professional life. Something moved through his face, not guilt, or not only guilt, something faster than that. A brief calculation, the recalibration of a man who had prepared for one kind of response and was receiving another. Celeste Ashcroft touched his arm with the proprietary ease of a woman claiming territory she had already decided was hers. She looked at Seraphina with the particular expression of a woman who had won, which was not triumph exactly, but something more refined, the pleasantly fixed smile of someone who no longer needs to compete. It's always difficult, I imagine, Celeste said, when circumstances require change. I do hope you'll adjust without too much distress. The word distress landed with specific precision, a small weapon delivered in the sweetest register. Seraphina looked at her. She looked at her for a long moment. Thank you for your concern, she said. Nothing else. No flinch, no color in her face, no tremor at the edge of the voice. Just the 4 words, flat and clean. What happened next was the part that the court would talk about for weeks, the part that would be added to and embroidered and exaggerated until the story bore limited resemblance to what actually occurred. What actually occurred was this. Lord Ellery Crane, one of the Blackthorne family's oldest social allies, and a man who had drunk too much at too many morning gatherings to know when to shut his mouth, laughed. He laughed from his position 6 feet away where he had stopped to watch, and his laugh was the short, brain sound of a man who thought he understood the joke. Well, he said, loudly enough for the nearby cluster of courtiers to hear. I suppose it was always a bit of a mismatch. Blackthorn needed someone who could actually do something with the position. No offense intended to the Vale family, of course, but he waved a hand that dismissed 3 generations in the gesture. There isn't much to the Vale name anymore, is there? The old man's estate was a ruin. What exactly was the arrangement supposed to bring the Duke? The room did not go quiet this time. The room did what rooms do when something genuinely savage happens in public. It went on performing normalcy while every set of ears tilted toward the scene. Saraphina turned her head slowly toward Ellery Crane. She looked at him the way she had sometimes looked at balance sheets that contained errors, with a kind of tired, precise attention, cataloging the problem without emotional investment in the problem's feelings. The Vale estate, she said, managed 11 shipping contracts through the Harwick port last quarter alone. 3 of those contracts supply materials to the Crane family's textile operations. She held his gaze. You're welcome. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Ellery Crane's smile went somewhere complicated. The courtiers nearby exchanged glances with the controlled urgency of people who were very interested in not appearing interested. Damian was watching her. She did not look at him. I believe, Saraphina said, addressing the air approximately midway between Damian and the cluster of courtiers, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but somehow carried clearly, that the appropriate business of the morning should proceed. Congratulations to the Duke and to Lady Ashcroft on their arrangement. She dipped her chin in the barest gesture of acknowledgement. I'll leave you to your announcement. She turned and walked out of the hall. She walked at exactly her normal pace, not hurried, not stiff, not the rigid performance of someone controlling themselves, but the actual walk of a woman with somewhere to be. She did not look back. She did not need to. The doors of the hall were heavy oak, and they swung closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. In the corridor outside, she walked for 37 steps before she stopped. She stood beside a window that looked out over the palace's eastern courtyard, where a groom was leading a gray horse in slow circles through the frost, and she pressed her fingers to the cold stone of the sill, and she breathed. Her throat felt tight in a way she was not going to allow to progress further than tightness. Her chest had that specific ache that was not grief exactly. She had felt grief, real grief, standing beside her grandfather's deathbed while the lawyers waited in the next room with their papers, but was something adjacent to it. The particular pain of being wrong about something you had quietly trusted. She had not trusted easily. That was the thing she would return to later, in the long nights when she would examine this morning the way she examined flawed contracts, looking for the exact clause where the liability had been hidden. She had not been naive. She had known that arranged engagements were transactional instruments, had known from the beginning that Damian Blackthorn had agreed to the arrangement because her grandfather's name had carried weight and because the Vale family's connections to the Southern merchant networks had strategic value. But she had also spent 3 years watching him think, had watched him struggle with the genuine ethical difficulties of managing an estate that employed 300 families and owed debts to another 500. Had watched him choose, more than once, the harder right thing over the easier expedient one. Had believed, because of what she had watched, that the man underneath the Duke's position was worth something real. She had been wrong, not about what he was capable of being, about what he actually was, today, now. A man who had chosen the brightest object in the room and called it strategy. The groom in the courtyard below walked the gray horse around again, methodical, unhurried, in the cold morning air. Saraphina breathed out slowly. She had work to do. She had letters to write and contracts to review, and 3 separate negotiations with guildmasters in the Harwick merchant district that needed her attention before the week was out. She had, in point of fact, more work than she could comfortably manage even without the distraction of a public dissolution, and the work would not wait because she had been humiliated. The work had never waited. That was how she had built what she had built. That was how she would continue. She straightened her spine. She smoothed the front of her gown with one hand, a small private gesture that meant nothing to anyone watching and meant something precise to her. The resetting of attention, the returning to what was real and controllable. She walked to the end of the corridor and down the east stairs and out of Thornwall Palace, and she did not go back. But Her grandfather's house, her house now, 2 years since his death, stood in the older district of the capital, where the streets were narrower and the buildings were stone rather than the fashionable new construction of the court quarter. It was not a small house. It was simply not a visible one. The facade was plain, the garden untended in the decorative sense, the entrance marked by nothing that announced ambition. Inside, it was something different. Saraphina had spent the 2 years since her grandfather's death reorganizing it, not as a residence but as an operations center, in the specific way that her grandfather had organized his study, the way she had learned to think about space as something to be used rather than displayed. The main study on the ground floor had a writing table large enough to hold 6 separate documents simultaneously and shelves on 3 walls that held ledgers organized by sector, year, and counterparty. The hearth at the end of the room was practical, not decorative, sized for heat rather than appearance. She arrived home in the mid-morning, dismissed her driver, and stood in the entrance hall for approximately 10 seconds. Then she went into the study, sat down, and started working. Margaret Hale, her secretary and the most competent person Saraphina had ever employed, appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later with tea and the morning's correspondence and the expression of someone who had heard something and was deciding whether to say so. "The quarterly gathering," Margaret said, setting the tea on the corner of the writing table where it would not encroach on the documents. She was a woman of about 50, gray-haired, dry of manner, with the particular organizational precision of someone who had spent decades managing things that other people were too important to manage themselves. "Has been addressed," Saraphina said, without looking up from the letter she was reading. "There will be correspondence regarding the formal dissolution of the Vale Blackthorn arrangement. When it arrives, log it, file it, and flag nothing for my attention unless it contains a specific financial claim." A brief pause. "I see," Margaret said, in the exact tone that meant she saw considerably more than she was saying. "And the Harwick meetings this week?" "Unchanged." Saraphina set down the letter and picked up the next one. "Send word to Master Callum at the Guild of Maritime Factors that I'll be there Thursday morning as scheduled. And get me the current status on the Aldermere grain account. I want to review it before the end of the day. It's on the 3rd shelf to your right, red ledger, 2nd from the end." "Thank you." Margaret moved to the door and stopped. She had worked for Saraphina for 4 years and had learned when to stop and when to keep going. "Are you all right?" Saraphina looked up then. She met Margaret's eyes with the direct attention that was simply how she looked at everything. "I will be," she said, and then, "I have work." Margaret nodded, once, and left. Saraphina sat with the letter in her hands for a moment longer than she needed to. The fire in the grate had been laid before her arrival and was building steadily. Outside the study's single window, the frost-pale morning was beginning to give way to the tentative gray of midday, the winter light that never fully committed. She put the letter down and reached for the red ledger. 6 months passed. This is the compressed truth of those months. Saraphina Vale worked. She worked the way she had always worked, without announcing it, without requiring anyone to witness it, with the focused and somewhat ruthless attention of a woman who had learned in her grandfather's study that the visible world operated on the invisible one, that courts and titles and public announcements were the surface of things, and that real power had always moved quietly underneath. Her grandfather, Edmund Vale, had begun as a merchant's 3rd son with a head for numbers and the specific kind of ambition that does not reveal itself in speeches. Over 40 years he had built, quietly, a network of financial investments, shipping interests, and guild relationships that was not a fortune in the conventional sense. It was not landed estate or accumulated title, but was something more resilient. It was leverage. It was the ability to move money and credit and trade routes in ways that the titled aristocracy depended on without ever quite understanding they depended on it. He had left it to Saraphina, not because she was his only heir, though she was, because she was the only person in 3 generations of the Vale family who had understood what he was building. She had spent 2 years since his death learning it the rest of the way, following the threads of his investments out to their ends, understanding which merchant guild relationships were nominal and which were structural, which shipping contracts contained provisions that gave her leverage over the counterparty's credit lines, which banking arrangements in the Harwick Port District effectively meant that certain noble houses' seasonal borrowing ran through accounts she controlled. The aristocracy of this kingdom thought of itself as the power that all other power served. They were not entirely wrong. They held land and title and the forms of authority that made formal governance possible. What they did not hold was the credit that kept their estates liquid through bad harvest years. What they did not hold was the shipping capacity that moved their agricultural output to markets where it was worth anything. What they did not hold was the guild networks that translated raw production into actual revenue. Saraphina held those. Not visibly. Not under her own name in most cases. Her grandfather had been meticulous about structure, about holding things through intermediaries and nominees and cooperative arrangements that distributed the apparent ownership while concentrating the actual control. She held them the way deep water holds a boat, invisibly, from underneath, doing the most essential work of keeping things afloat in ways that the people being held did not see or think about because they had no reason to think about what kept them up. She continued thinking about Damian Blackthorne approximately as often as he would have thought about her, which is to say, sometimes and involuntarily. There were moments, reviewing the quarterly performance of the Harwick Maritime Factors, when she would think of the conversation they had had about the eastern trade routes, how specifically he had understood the problem, and she would feel something not quite like loss but adjacent to it, the waste of a thing that could have been something. The particular sadness of a door closed on a room you had not quite finished seeing. She did not dwell. She had never been built for dwelling. She had been built for the next thing, the forward motion of work and consequence. What she did not do, in those 6 months, was interfere with Damian Blackthorne's affairs. She made no decisions about him. She simply managed what she managed, and the world moved the way the world moved, and she kept her attention on the red ledger and the Thursday meetings at the Guild of Maritime Factors, and the steady, invisible work of the things she had inherited and was building into something larger. And what? She was at the Harwick Port District on a Thursday in late autumn when she first heard about the trouble with Blackthorne's Eastern contracts. She heard it from Master Callum, who was not a gossip, but was a thorough and accurate reporter of market intelligence, and who told her as a routine matter of commercial relevance that the Blackthorne Estate's 3 primary grain trading contracts in the Eastern District had encountered, his word, complications. "What kind?" she said. "The shipping company they use for the eastern route, Vanson's out of Callaway, has suspended service on that corridor pending renegotiation of their harbor access fees. Apparently, the Callaway Port Authority changed its fee structure last quarter. Vanson's can't make the numbers work at current freight rates, and Blackthorne's contracts were priced on the old structure." Master Callum spread his hands. Bad timing, could have hedged against it with the right contract provisions, but he shrugged, the shrug of a man who had seen this particular oversight many times. Saraphina looked at the contract documents spread across the table between them. She was thinking about something else, a thread she was pulling at the edge of her attention, the specific way that the Callaway Port Authority's fee restructuring had been implemented and who had been in a position to anticipate it. She had been in a position to anticipate it. She had known about the Callaway restructuring 8 months before its implementation because the financing for the Port Authority's capital upgrade had run through a credit arrangement that involved one of the Vale Network's subsidiary banking relationships. She had not told Damian. She had had no reason to tell him. He had not asked for her counsel on Eastern trade routes, or on anything else. He had sent her dissolution papers through appropriate channels. "Is there a path around it for Vanson's?" she asked, returning her attention to the present conversation. "Not in the short term. The Callaway fees are what they are. Vanson's would need either a rate increase from their clients or a reduction in their own operating costs, and neither happens quickly. What about the Harwick Northern route? Longer, but the infrastructure is established and the harbor fees are stable." Master Callum considered this with the expression of a man running calculations. "Possible. More expensive. Adds about 9 days to the eastern delivery. Blackthorne's downstream buyers might push back on the timing adjustment. But it's viable. For a carrier willing to absorb the initial risk of a new route relationship, yes." Saraphina made a note in her ledger. Not about Blackthorne specifically. About the general opportunity in the northern route, which was genuinely underutilized, which would benefit several clients whose business she actually cared about managing. She filed it the way she filed everything, accurately, without sentiment, in the appropriate section. The news got worse for Damian Blackthorne over the following months, and Saraphina heard about it the way she heard about everything, through the natural flow of market intelligence that reached her through the guild networks and the banking relationships and the shipping factors she worked with routinely. She did not seek it out. She did not need to. The Eastern contract failure had a downstream effect. Two of Blackthorne's primary creditors, who held seasonal debt extended against the anticipated revenue from those Eastern contracts, called in their notes early. Standard protective measure on the creditor's part, logical, painful for the debtor. One of those creditors had extended the credit through a lending house that was itself capitalized, in part, through a Veil Network fund. Saraphina had had no specific knowledge of Blackthorne's individual debt structure when the fund made its lending decisions. The lending house operated through an intermediary that managed its portfolio without reporting individual borrower identities to her. She learned of the connection only when she reviewed the lending house's quarterly report and saw the Blackthorne name on a list of accounts with elevated recovery risk. She sat with that quarterly report for a long moment, in the study, with the fire going and the early winter dark pressing against the window. She had not done this. She needed to be honest with herself about that, because honesty was the discipline she held above all others. She had not structured these things to harm him. The Eastern route had moved the way markets moved, because of decisions made by port authorities and shipping companies and creditors acting in their own rational interests, none of which had consulted her or required her direction. She was simply the place where a great many of those rational interests intersected, and she had been that place for years, quietly, and Damian Blackthorne had never known it, and she had never had occasion to explain it, and now the intersection was becoming visible to him in the worst possible way. She thought about what she would do if he came to her, not if, when. She was fairly certain it would be when. She thought about what she would say. She had not decided, and she told herself she had not decided because there was no decision yet required, because he had not come, and she would wait until the fact existed before she determined her response to it. This was how she operated. This was how she had always operated. But she sat with the quarterly report longer than she needed to, and the fire burned lower, and she did not reach for the next document. Checked. He came on a Tuesday morning in late November, and he came alone. Saraphina was in the study when Margaret appeared in the doorway with an expression that conveyed information before words. "The Duke of Blackthorne," Margaret said, "is at the front door. He has no appointment." A pause. "He asked if you would see him." Saraphina set down her pen. She had prepared, in some functional sense, for this moment, had thought through the shape of it, had considered the various forms it might take. What she had not prepared for, specifically, was the thing she felt when Margaret said the words. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something quieter and colder than either. The recognition that she had been right about the when, and that being right about it did not make it simple. "Show him in," she said. She stood when he entered because she always stood when receiving a visitor. It was a practice her grandfather had taught her, the posture of someone who received rather than waited, which was not a small distinction. She stood behind her writing table with the morning's work still spread across it and looked at Damian Blackthorne in her study. He looked worse than she had seen him. Not destroyed, he was too armored for destruction to show easily, but worn. The particular weariness of a man who had spent months at the wrong end of consequences he had not anticipated. His coat was well made, but less meticulous than the court presentation she had last seen him in. The lines around his eyes were deeper. He stood in the doorway of her study and took in the room. The shelves, the ledgers, the 4 separate document piles, the map on the wall with its penciled notations, and she watched him register what he was looking at. "Lady Saraphina," he said. "Your Grace." She gestured toward the chair across the writing table. "Sit down." He sat. He sat with the posture of a man who was used to sitting in positions of authority and was, in this moment, uncertain of his authority, and the uncertainty was visible in the way he positioned his hands, not spread with the ease of the powerful, but clasped, wrists on his knees. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. She did not say anything. "What I did, in the hall, at the quarterly gathering, was wrong. The manner of it, the public manner of it." He paused. She could see him searching for the right form of words, and she watched him try 2 or 3 sentences internally and discard them. I was not fair to you, and I was not honest. I had known about my intention regarding Lady Ashcroft for some time before that morning, and I gave you no warning, and I allowed the scene that occurred to occur when I could have prevented it. And he stopped. I'm sorry. The apology was genuine. She could hear that. She had heard enough false apologies in business negotiations to know the texture of a real one. She said, "What do you want?" It was not a question exactly, not an accusation. It was simply the returning of the conversation to its actual business, the cutting away of the courtesies to the thing underneath. He held her gaze. I need help. I know. Something moved through his face. How much do you know? She looked at the shelves behind him for a moment, then back at him. Enough, she said. What specifically are you asking me for? He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. She recognized the format, a creditor's demand summary, and placed it on the edge of the writing table. My Eastern contracts have collapsed. The Vanson suspension was the beginning of it. I have 2 creditors calling notes simultaneously, a harvest that underperformed by 30% due to the late cold snap in the Aldermere Valley, and a downstream buyer in the eastern markets who is now disputing the delivery terms of a contract I can no longer fulfill on schedule. He looked at her directly. I know you have relationships in the Harwick district, with the Maritime Factors Guild, with the shipping carriers who work the northern route. He stopped. Then, I know that some of the credit arrangements affecting my situation. I'm learning that some of them connect back to funds and accounts that have connections to your family's investment structures. The room was very quiet. The fire made its small sounds. That's not a specific enough claim to respond to, Saraphina said. What exactly are you saying you know? He held her eyes and said it without flinching, which she gave him credit for. I'm saying I'm beginning to understand that your financial position, the actual scope of it, is considerably larger than anything I understood when our arrangement was formed, and that several of the institutional relationships that are currently creating difficulty for my estate have connections, direct or structural, to your family's network. He paused. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what I've found, and I'm asking whether you can help me, and He stopped again, and this time the stopping was different. This time it was a man arriving at something that cost him. I'm asking you to help me not because you owe me anything, because you don't owe me anything, but because I need it, and because I'm sitting in your study asking directly rather than looking for another way around it. Saraphina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Tell me the exact terms of the 2 creditor notes, the amounts, the original credit periods, the specific provisions that allow them to call early. He looked at her. She watched the look, the surprise, the recalibration, the reassessment of a man looking at something and understanding that what he thought he was looking at is not what it actually is. You're going to help me, he said. I'm going to listen to the specifics, she said. Then I'll determine what's appropriate. She reached for a fresh page. Her pen was in her hand. The terms. Start with the first creditor. He started talking, and she started writing, and outside the study window, the winter light was doing what winter light always did in this part of the city, coming in gray and thin and without comfort, and the fire kept burning, and the clock on the mantel kept its patient count of the hours. And if there was something in the room that was not entirely business, some charge in the air between them, some specific quality of attention that was not purely financial, neither of them named it, not yet. What Saraphina did not tell him, sitting there with her pen moving and her face composed and her handwriting precise as always, was what she had found in the lending house's quarterly report 2 weeks prior. Not Damian's debt structure, though that was there. Something else. A pattern in the recovery risk assessments, a specific clustering of distressed accounts, that had made her pull a second report and then a third, that had sent her back through 3/4 of data looking for the thread she thought she might be following. She had found it. And what she had found was not the ordinary motion of markets and bad luck and poor contract timing. What she had found was deliberate. Someone had been moving against Damian Blackthorne's financial interests with a precision that was not accidental, had been timing interventions, placing pressure at specific structural points, coordinating the Callaway fee restructuring timing with the creditor calls in a way that required foreknowledge and access and intent. She had not yet found the who. She was very close to finding the who. What she did know, what she was becoming more certain of with every hour she spent in the third quarterly report, with every cross-reference she ran against the dates of the interventions, was that whoever had done this had access to information about Damian Blackthorne's financial structure that was not publicly available. Information that, she was beginning to think, could only have come from someone very close to the Duke himself. She kept writing. The clock kept counting. Damian was still talking when the letter arrived, Margaret bringing it to the study door with the particular look she used for correspondence that required immediate attention. The seal on the letter was one Saraphina recognized. The financial registry office of the Harwick district, which she had been expecting to hear from for several days. She broke it open and read it while Damian paused, and what she read made her very still for a moment. The stillness that was not composure, but its precursor, the body catching up to what the mind had just understood. She looked up from the letter. Damian was watching her. "What is it?" he said. She folded the letter carefully. She set it face down on the writing table. "How well," she said slowly, "do you trust Pemberton Ash?" The question landed in the room like something heavy dropped from height. She watched Damian's face in the moment after it landed, watched the confusion, the instinctive defense, and then, underneath both of those, the arrival of something darker. The specific expression of a man who has had a thought he has been refusing to have, and has just run out of reasons to refuse it. "He's been my chancellor for 7 years, Damian said. His voice was careful. Too careful. "That's not what I asked," Saraphina said. The fire cracked once in the grate. The winter light pressed against the window, going nowhere, offering nothing, the way winter light in this city always ended the day. Arriving without comfort, departing without ceremony, leaving the room darker than it found it. Damian Blackthorne stared at her across the writing table with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he could not yet see the bottom of, and beginning to understand that the fall was going to be longer than he thought. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment and artistic purposes. All characters, events, and institutions depicted are entirely fictional and bear no resemblance to real persons or actual events. Damian did not answer immediately. That was the tell. Saraphina had spent enough time across tables from men who were recalculating to know the specific texture of a silence that was not confusion, but reordering. The rapid internal sorting of a man who was taking something he had believed and placing it against something new, and finding that the two shapes did not match. "Ash has managed the Blackthorne estate accounts for 7 years, he said finally. He came with commendations from Lord Hartwell's household. His record has been—" "I'm not asking about his record," Saraphina said. "I'm asking whether you trust him. Those are different questions." Damian's jaw tightened. "What did the letter say?" She looked at him across the writing table. The letter was face down between them, and she did not turn it over. Not yet. "The Harwick Financial Registry Office has been tracking an anomaly," she said. 3 separate investment funds that hold positions in your estate's primary creditors have been coordinating their recovery actions, timing their calls, sharing borrower intelligence, moving in sequence rather than independently. She watched his face. That kind of coordination requires shared information. Specifically, it requires someone who knows the internal structure of your debt obligations well enough to know exactly when and where to apply pressure for maximum effect. The fire was the only sound in the room for several seconds. "That's not public information," Damian said. "No. The only people who have access to that level of internal detail are—" He stopped. "Are," she said. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had arrived somewhere he did not want to be and could not leave. "Myself. My estate solicitor. And Ash." Saraphina did not say anything. She did not need to. She simply let the arithmetic sit between them, the way you set down a document you want someone to read without telling them to read it, putting it within reach, letting them choose the moment of contact. Damian stood up. He walked to the window, not to look out of it, but to move, to put distance between himself and the calculation he was running, as if the calculation would be different from 6 feet away. His hands went behind his back, then dropped to his sides, then found the window ledge. 7 years, he said, quietly. Not to her. Yes. He was in the room when I negotiated the Vanson's contract. He was the one who recommended Vanson's. He turned from the window. His face had gone through several things in the last 30 seconds and had arrived at something she recognized, the controlled fury of a man who had been betrayed slowly over a long period of time by someone he had trusted completely. It was a specific expression. She had seen it before. It looked different on different men. On Damian, it looked like a door closing. Before you move on that conclusion, she said, I need you to hear something. He looked at her. I'm not certain it's Ash. I'm certain the coordination exists, and I'm certain it required inside access, and Ash is the most probable source of that access. But probable is not the same as certain, and if you go back to Thornwall and confront him on what we currently have, she paused deliberately. You will tell him exactly how much you know. And whatever he is or isn't, that ends our ability to find out the rest. Our. She heard the word leave her mouth and saw him hear it, saw something shift very slightly in his expression. The recognition of a pronoun that had not been present in their conversation until this moment. You're going to help me find the rest, he said. It was not quite a question. It was the way a man states something he is not sure he has the right to state, but states it anyway, watching for the correction. Saraphina picked up her pen. She looked at the document he had placed on the edge of her writing table, the creditor demand summary, and then at the page of notes she had taken while he talked. The northern route, she said. I can make an introduction to a carrier who's been looking for established volume on that corridor. It buys you time on the delivery dispute. Your eastern buyer gets their goods late, but they get them, and late is a renegotiation, not a default. She looked up. The 2 creditor notes are more complicated. One of them I can influence indirectly. There's a banking relationship involved that gives me some ability to suggest a restructuring conversation. The other one I cannot touch without making visible things that I prefer to keep invisible. He was watching her with the focused attention of a man who is recalibrating his entire understanding of a situation, doing it in real time, trying to keep up. How long have you been managing this? He said. All of it. The network. The scale of it. My grandfather built the foundation over 40 years. I've been managing and expanding it for 2. And you were going to... He stopped himself. Was going to what? He looked at her directly. The weariness was still there, but something else had moved into it, something complicated and unguarded. Bring it into a marriage arrangement. With me. That was the intention at the time, yes. And you never told me. You never asked. She said it without heat. Pure fact, delivered flat. You assumed you understood the scope of the Veil assets because you understood the Veil name. Most people make that assumption. I found it useful not to correct it prematurely. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man reassessing not just the present situation, but the past several years. I made a significant mistake, he said. Yes. About you. About what I was, and about what you were choosing when you chose to remove it. She set her pen down. That's not the present conversation. The present conversation is your estate, which is in real trouble, and Pemberton Ash, who may or may not be the mechanism of that trouble, and what we do about both. He came back to the chair and sat down. The posture was different now, not the careful bearing of a duke in a formal setting, but something more stripped, a man sitting down with the actual weight of his situation. What do you need from me? Access, she said. I need to see the full Blackthorn estate account structure, so not the summary version your solicitor keeps, the underlying records, contract terms, credit arrangements, the specific provisions that govern early call rights. I need to see where the vulnerabilities are, which means I need to see everything. He held her eyes for a moment. You're asking me to hand you a complete picture of my financial exposure. Yes. To a woman who has every reason to want to see my estate fail. She held his gaze steadily. If I wanted your estate to fail, Your Grace, I would not have agreed to see you this morning. Another silence, longer than the others. "All right," he said. He left 2 hours later with a list in his coat pocket, names of contacts she had written out in her precise hand, specific language she had told him to use in requesting the Northern Carrier introduction, instructions about what not to say when speaking with the second creditor's representative. He left the same way he had arrived, alone, and without the particular armor of entitlement that she associated with him in public settings. He left like a man who had sat down with one understanding of the world and stood up with another. Saraphina stood at the study window and watched his carriage move down the street until it rounded the corner. Then she turned back to her desk. Margaret appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later with the look of someone who had been professionally incurious for 2 hours and had earned the right to stop. "The Harwick letter," Margaret said. "Yes." "Is there more to it than what you told him?" Saraphina looked at her. Margaret had been with her long enough to ask the question. She had also been with her long enough to know that there were questions that got answers and questions that got a particular quality of silence, and to read the difference accurately. This one got an answer because Margaret would need to understand the shape of what was coming in order to manage the correspondence correctly. "The registry office flagged a fourth fund," Saraphina said, "one that the initial analysis missed because it's domiciled in the Callaway Financial District under a name that doesn't connect obviously to the other three." She moved back to the desk. "The Callaway Fund's account of record for correspondence is a solicitor's office on Terrace Street." Margaret waited. "The same solicitor's office," Saraphina said, "that holds the account of record for several of Lady Celeste Ashcroft's personal investment holdings." The quality of Margaret's stillness changed, not dramatically, but Saraphina had worked with her long enough to read the small calibrations. "That's not a coincidence," Margaret said. "No, it is not. So Lady Ashcroft is either a passive beneficiary who happens to share a solicitor with someone who has been actively working against Blackthorn's estate." Saraphina sat down. "Or she is not passive. And Ash? Ash may be the instrument. Ashcroft may be the architect." She pulled the letter back toward her and looked at it again, at the specific account number in the fourth fund's registration, at the Callaway solicitor's address. "Or they are both instruments, and there is someone further back who we haven't reached yet." She set the letter down. "I need the full Blackthorn estate records before I can determine which." "He's going to send them?" "He said he would." Margaret absorbed this. "You trust that?" Saraphina thought about Damian sitting across from her, the posture of a man stripped of the usual scaffolding, the way he had said all right. Not with relief, but with the specific weight of a man making a decision he understood was real. "He came alone," she said. "He didn't send a secretary. He didn't open with legal framing." She looked at the window. "He came and said he was sorry, and then he asked directly. Those are not the moves of a man running a second game." "No," Margaret agreed. "They're the moves of a man who's out of options." "That too," Saraphina said. "Get me the Callaway registry records. Whatever is public, pull it, and find out who the principal of that solicitor's office has represented in the last 5 years. Every significant client, every major transaction. I want it by Friday." The Blackthorn estate records arrived on Thursday by private courier in a leather case sealed with Damian's personal mark. Saraphina opened the case at a writing table with Margaret beside her and spent the first 2 hours simply reading, not analyzing, just reading, building the structure of it in her mind the way her grandfather had taught her, understanding the shape before you started looking for the breaks in it. The shape was more exposed than she had expected. Damian was not, she found, financially reckless. The underlying estate structure was actually reasonably sound, built on productive land and established trading relationships that had been generating steady returns for decades. What had been done to it was surgical. Someone who understood the architecture had identified the 3 or 4 structural joints where pressure would do the most damage, and had applied pressure to exactly those points in exactly the right sequence. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. This was not opportunism. This was not someone who had spotted a weakness and exploited it. This was a plan. This had been planned before the Eastern contracts failed, before the creditors called their notes. The groundwork had been laid 18 months ago, based on what she was reading, with the Callaway Port Authority fee restructuring being the triggering mechanism for a cascade that someone had designed carefully. 18 months ago. 6 months before the quarterly gathering at Thornwall Palace. 6 months before Damian had walked into that hall with Celeste Ashcroft on his arm. Saraphina's pen stopped moving. She looked at the document in front of her. She looked at the timeline she had been building in her notebook. She looked at the specific date notation on a preliminary Callaway fund registration that the registry office had included in their correspondence. Her mind moved through it the way water moves through a known channel, quickly, following the gradient, arriving at the lowest point without hesitation. Celeste Ashcroft had not found Damian. Damian had not found Celeste. The relationship had been engineered. The conditions that made Damian susceptible to it had been created. The financial pressure that would eventually require him to seek help had been planned, and the plan had been in motion before any of the surface events had occurred. Someone had looked at Damian Blackthorne and decided to own him. Through Celeste, through the estate's financial collapse, through the manufactured dependency that would follow, and someone, she looked at the fourth fund registration again, at the Callaway solicitor's address, at the thread she had been pulling since Tuesday, had access to information that let them design a plan this specific. Information about the estate's internal structure, information about Damian's patterns and vulnerabilities, information about what Damian valued and where he was exposed, information that Pemberton Ash had been in a position to provide for 7 years. She closed the ledger. She placed her hands flat on the writing table and breathed once, slowly. The fire in the grate, the clock on the mantel, the winter light at the window, thinner now, the afternoon going already. Ash had been feeding information to Celeste Ashcroft's network for an unknown period. Celeste's network had used that information to build a financial trap around Damian's estate, while simultaneously positioning Celeste as the romantic solution to the crisis she had helped engineer. When Damian fell for Celeste, and he had fallen, Saraphina was honest enough to acknowledge that whatever Celeste was, she was also genuinely effective. He had dissolved his existing engagement and pulled himself away from the one person in his immediate circle who might have had both the knowledge and the resources to see what was happening. He had pushed Saraphina away at exactly the moment someone needed him to push her away. She did not feel what she expected to feel when she understood this. She had half expected some specific vindication, some cleanness in the confirmation that the morning at Thornwall had not been purely Damian's choice, but something that had been moved around him. What she actually felt was colder and quieter than vindication. It was the particular focus that came when a problem resolved from complicated to clear, when you stopped looking at a map and started seeing a road. She reached for a fresh page. She began to write. She was 3 paragraphs into the letter, to a specific contact in the Callaway Financial District, carefully worded, requesting information she needed in a form that would not reveal why she needed it, when Margaret knocked and entered without waiting, which was the signal they used for things that could not wait. "There's a man at the door," Margaret said. "He came to the service entrance. He says he's a member of the Blackthorne household staff and that he has information for you." She paused. "He specifically said to tell you it's about Chancellor Ash. He says Ash is moving something tonight." Saraphina looked up from the letter. "Tonight," she repeated. "That's what he said." She looked at the clock. 3:30 in the afternoon. Whatever Ash was moving, wherever he was moving it in less than 12 hours. She thought about the estate records in the leather case on her table. She thought about the 4th fund registration in Callaway. She thought about 18 months of deliberate architecture, a plan that had been running longer than she had known to look for it, that had used Damian's own chancellor as its primary instrument. She thought about the letter she had not finished writing, the contact in Callaway who would not receive it in time to matter, and the man at her service entrance who had chosen to bring her information about tonight. She thought about what it meant that Ash was moving something now, the timing of it, the fact that Damian had come to her on Tuesday, and Ash was moving on Thursday, and whether that was coincidence or whether something Damian had done or said in his own household had triggered an acceleration of the plan. She set down her pen. "Bring him in," she said. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment and artistic purposes. All characters, events, and institutions depicted are entirely fictional and bear no resemblance to real persons or actual events. The man at the service entrance was young, younger than Saraphina had expected, perhaps 22, with the lean and watchful look of someone who had spent years making himself unnoticeable in rooms where powerful people talked. He gave his name as Thomas Vey. He said he was a junior records clerk in the Blackthorn household administrative office, which meant he sat in the outer room of Ash's chancellery and copied documents and carried correspondence and was, in the way of junior clerks everywhere, effectively invisible to the men whose work he facilitated. He sat in the chair across Saraphina's writing table with his cap held in both hands and his eyes moving carefully around the room, not nervously, but with the specific attention of a man who was assessing where he had landed. "How did you know to come to me?" Saraphina said. "I've worked in the chancellery for 2 years," Thomas said. "I know what documents Chancellor Ash reviews and what documents he doesn't. For the last 18 months, certain account summaries from the estate's credit arrangements have been copied, not in the official record, copied separately, by hand, in Ash's own handwriting, and sent out under private seal." He paused. "I know where they were sent because I was the one who carried them to the courier." "And you said nothing for 18 months. He met her eyes steadily. "I said nothing because I didn't know what I was carrying. Letters from a chancellor to external business contacts aren't unusual. I didn't understand what was in them." He stopped. 3 days ago, the Duke came back from an appointment in the city and had a private meeting with Ash that lasted 40 minutes. When Ash came out of that meeting, he sent me to retrieve a specific file from the estate vault, a file containing original contract instruments, not copies. He told me to package them for courier delivery. Thomas's hands tightened slightly on the cap. "Original instruments, not copies. The originals leave the vault for one reason." Saraphina looked at him. "To transfer them." "Yes, ma'am." She was already calculating. Damian had come to her Tuesday. He had gone back to Thornwall. He had done something, said something, asked something, made some move that Ash had read as a signal that the situation was changing, that the protection of proximity was eroding. And Ash, understanding that his window was closing, had decided to move. Original contract instruments removed from the estate vault meant one of two things. They were being transferred as collateral for a new debt arrangement, which required the Duke's authorization and signature. Or they were being removed without that authorization, which was something else entirely. "What file?" she said, specifically. "The Aldermere property instruments, the title documentation for the 3 northern estates in the Aldermere Valley." The Aldermere estates. Saraphina's mind moved through what she knew about the Blackthorn holdings in the north. Productive grain land, substantial assessed value, and more relevantly, the specific legal structure her grandfather had noted in his records years ago when the Vale Network had briefly considered a trade partnership with the Blackthorn estate. The Aldermere properties were held under a deed structure that allowed them to be transferred without requiring the full estate seal, only the chancellery seal, because a previous duke had set them up as administratively separate from the main holdings for tax purposes. Ash could transfer them. With his chancellery seal and the original instruments and the right counterparty waiting in Callaway, he could move those properties tonight without Damian's signature. "Where is the courier delivering them?" she said. "I don't know the final destination. The courier Ash uses for this kind of package is not the household's regular service. He's a private man, goes by Ferris, operates out of the dockside quarter." Thomas looked at her directly. "But I know what time Ash is sending the package. He told me to have it ready by 8 o'clock this evening. The courier picks up at 9. It was 4:15. Saraphina looked at the clock. She looked at the Blackthorn estate records on her table, at the specific page she had been reading when Margaret knocked, the Aldermere property structure laid out in the precise and damning clarity of original documentation. She had 4 hours and 45 minutes. She picked up her pen. "Margaret," she said, without raising her voice. Margaret was already in the doorway. "Send word to Master Callum at the Maritime Factors Guild. Tell him I need 2 hours of his time this evening. 7 o'clock. Here. Tell him it's the Aldermere matter, and he'll understand." She looked at Thomas Vey. "You're going back to the Chancellery." He blinked. "Ma'am, you're going back, and you're going to behave exactly as you have behaved for 2 years. You are going to prepare that package as Ash instructed. You are going to have it ready at 8 o'clock. She held his gaze. And when Ash asks if everything is in order, you are going to say yes. A silence. Thomas Vey looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of what he had walked into. You need the package to leave, he said slowly. I need the package to reach the courier, and I need to know who the courier delivers it to. She set down the pen. Can you mark it? Something in the packaging, something that isn't visible unless you know to look? He thought about this for 3 seconds. There's a way to fold the outer wrap, a specific crease pattern. I used it once before when I was trying to identify which packages were going to which destinations. The courier won't notice it. The recipient won't know unless they've been told. Tell me the pattern. He described it. She wrote it down. She looked at it, looked at him. If Ash finds out you came to me, she said, you understand what that means for your position. I understand. Why are you doing this? Thomas Vey looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at her. Because I've spent 2 years being invisible in that office, he said. And invisible people see things. And what I've seen is a man I work for stealing from a house that's employed my family for 30 years. He paused. My father is a groundskeeper on the Aldermere estate. Those properties go to some Callaway fund. He loses his position. He stopped. That's why. Saraphina looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest registered the specific weight of that. The groundskeeper's son, invisible in the chancellery, watching the theft of his father's livelihood with the careful attention of a man who had no power except the power of having seen it clearly. Go back, she said. Do exactly what I told you. And Thomas, if anything changes, if Ash moves the timeline, if the package goes out early, find a way to get word to me. He nodded once, put on his cap, and left through the service entrance. She sent word to Damian at 5 o'clock. Not a letter, too slow, and the wrong form for what needed to be communicated. She sent Margaret directly to Thornwall Palace, with a verbal message to be delivered to the Duke personally. Come to the study on Ardmore Street at 7 o'clock this evening. Come alone. Bring nothing you don't want Ash to know you've taken. The last sentence was the signal. If Damian understood anything from Tuesday's conversation, he would understand that sentence. She spent the next 2 hours working, not on the Blackthorn records, those were as understood as they were going to be, but on the Callaway Fund registration documents, pulling every thread she could reach through the contacts and records she had access to from the study. What she was building was not yet proof. It was the architecture of proof. The shape of the connections laid out clearly enough that when the final pieces came in, they would click into place rather than require interpretation. The Callaway Solicitor's Office. The Fourth Fund. Celeste Ashcroft's investment accounts. The timeline of the original fund registration against the timeline of Ash's private correspondence beginning 18 months ago. The Aldermere property structure and the specific legal provision that made tonight's transfer possible. She laid it all out on the writing table in sequence, the way her grandfather had taught her. Not as a story, but as a system, each element connected to the next by documented relationship rather than inference. Where she had inference, she marked it clearly. She would not present inference as fact. That was the discipline. Master Callum arrived at 7 exactly. He was a compact, gray-haired man of about 60 who had spent 40 years in the maritime factors trade and had the specific patience of someone who had learned that most crises resolved into logistics problems if you waited long enough to see them clearly. He looked at the documents she showed him for 12 minutes without speaking. The Callaway Fund holds positions in all 3 of the Blackthorn creditors, he said finally. Yes. And you believe the Aldermere instruments are being transferred to that fund tonight as what? Collateral payment? Direct acquisition? Direct acquisition, most likely. The fund absorbs the properties against the outstanding debt. On paper, it looks like a creditor protection action. She looked at the documents. Without the original instruments, Blackthorn cannot contest the transfer in the registry system. The instruments are the only documentation that establish the original deed structure and the limitations on transfer authority. Callum made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word. The carrier Ash is using, Saraphina said. Ferris, out of the dockside quarter. Do you know him? By name, not by direct relationship. I need to know who he delivers to. Tonight, specifically. I can tell you the package will have a specific fold mark on the outer wrap. She described it. If there's someone who can shadow the delivery, there's someone, Callum said. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. This was how they had always worked. She stated what was needed, he assessed what was possible, they met in the middle without requiring each other to explain more than was necessary. It will cost. I know. And if the delivery goes to a Callaway address, then we have the direct link between the fund and the transfer, and the link between the fund and Ashcroft's solicitor. She looked at him. That's the piece I need. Callum nodded slowly. He looked at the documents again. Lady Ashcroft, he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who understood what he was saying. She's been at court for what, 3 seasons? 4. And in that time, she's built a financial network sophisticated enough to run an operation like this. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a woman who arrived at court looking for a husband. No, Saraphina said. It is not. The door opened and Margaret appeared. The Duke, she said. Dong. Damian came in looking like a man who had spent the last 2 hours not sleeping. He took in Callum's presence at the table with a quick assessment, the specific alertness of someone who had arrived expecting one conversation and was recalibrating for a larger one. Master Callum, he said, with the automatic social registration of his class. Your Grace. Callum stood briefly, nodded, sat back down. Damian looked at Saraphina. Your message. Sit down, she said. He sat. He looked at the documents spread across the table, at the Callaway fund registration, at the timeline she had built, and she watched his eyes move across it with increasing velocity, the reading pace of someone who was connecting things faster than was comfortable. The Aldermere instruments, he said. He looked up. How did you? Thomas Vey, she said. Your chancellery clerk. Something moved through his face. He came to you. This afternoon, yes. Damian sat very still. The stillness was different from Tuesday's stillness. That had been a man holding himself together under difficulty. This was something deeper. This was a man touching the specific bottom of a thing. 7 years of proximity, 7 years of Ash sitting across from him in meetings, managing his accounts, recommending his business partners, carrying his correspondence. Tonight, Mum, Damian said. He's moving the Aldermere instruments tonight. At 9 o'clock. The package is already prepared. She watched him. I told Vey to let it go. His head came up sharply. I need to know where it goes. I need the documented link between Ash's transfer and the Callaway fund, and between the Callaway fund and Ashcroft's accounts. If we intercept the package before delivery, we have evidence of the attempt but not the network. We need the network. She held his gaze. Which means tonight, we let Ash think he's succeeded. Damian looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the specific cost of it, the idea of letting those documents leave the vault, letting the transfer reach its destination, the exposure that created. And if the link doesn't materialize, he said, if the delivery goes somewhere that doesn't connect to Ashcroft, then we are in a worse position than we are now, she said evenly. That's the risk. I am telling you what it is. The clock on the mantel read 7:22. Damian looked at the table. He looked at the Callaway fund registration. He looked at his own estate records, the leather case he had sent her 3 days ago, with his personal mark on the seal. She planned this before she met me, he said. It was not quite a question. The fund was registered 18 months before the quarterly gathering where you first appeared publicly together, Saraphina said. The initial correspondence from Ash to the external accounts began approximately 1 month after that registration. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. I dissolved our engagement, he said. He said it looking at the table, not at her. I humiliated you in front of the entire court. And I did it. He stopped. I did it because of a woman who had already designed the outcome she wanted from me and used my own chancellor to make certain conditions were right for me to... He stopped again. Saraphina did not fill the silence. She was not going to fill it. He was arriving somewhere real, and real arrivals required the space to land. To be what she needed you to be, Callum said from his side of the table, quietly, without editorial. just finishing the sentence because it needed finishing. Damian looked up. His face had arrived at the expression she had seen forming earlier in the evening, something stripped of the usual scaffolding, not vulnerable exactly, but uncovered. A man looking at the architecture of his own decisions and understanding, for the first time, how much of it had been built by someone else's hands. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "Nothing tonight," Saraphina said. "Tonight you go back to Thornwall, and you behave as you always behave, and you give Ash no indication that anything has changed. Tomorrow morning, when Callum's contact reports on the delivery, we will know who received the package. At that point," she looked at the documents, "we move quickly, because once Ash realizes the transfer is being traced, he will cover what he can. And Celeste." The name fell into the room differently than it had before. Not with the weight of romantic entanglement, with the weight of a calculation gone wrong. "Lady Ashcroft's involvement becomes provable when the Calloway Fund link is established," Saraphina said. "That link goes directly to her solicitor's office. At that point, we have documented evidence of a coordinated scheme to defraud the Blackthorn estate through the manipulation of its internal financial management." She paused. "It will need to be presented publicly. Quietly settling it gives her the opportunity to contest and delay. It needs to happen in front of witnesses who cannot be managed." Damian understood immediately. She saw him understand it. "The court," he said. "The next formal gathering of the High Houses is in 12 days. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a very public destruction." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her directly. The first fully direct look of the evening, the kind that had no calculation in it, no management of impression. "You could have done this without me," he said. "You had enough from the registry records to take this to the financial authorities without ever involving me directly." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" The fire in the grate. The clock. The documents between them on the table. The accumulated paper evidence of a plan that had been running for 18 months while neither of them had known to look for it. "Because it's your estate," she said, "and your name, and you had the right to know." It was the simplest true thing she had said in the entire conversation. She watched it land on him with the specific weight of simple true things, heavier than complicated ones in the end. Damian stood. He looked at Callum briefly, the professional acknowledgement of one man to another. Then he looked at Saraphina, and the look held something that was not yet named and would not be named tonight, because tonight was not the night for it, and both of them knew it. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He left. Callum began gathering his coat. "You know," he said conversationally, the tone of a man who had earned the right to say things sideways, "when your grandfather built this network, he always said the hardest part wasn't finding the leverage. It was knowing when to use it and when to wait." He looked at the documents on the table. He would have made the same call you made tonight. Let it run, see where it goes. A pause. He also would have pointed out that you've now committed yourself to standing in a court full of people who watched you walk out of that hall 6 months ago and presenting evidence that publicly dismantles one of the season's most admired women. "I know," Saraphina said. "There will be people in that room," Callum said carefully, "who would prefer a quieter resolution, who have their own relationships with Lady Ashcroft, who will not be glad to see what you're bringing. I know that too." He nodded once and moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "The Calloway contact will report by 6 tomorrow morning. I'll send word immediately." He looked back at her. "Get some sleep, Lady Saraphina. Tomorrow starts early and goes long." He left. Saraphina sat alone in the study with the fire burning low and the clock marking the minutes toward 9 o'clock, when a courier named Ferris would pick up a package from the Blackthorn household service entrance and carry it to a destination that would tell her everything she needed to know, or would tell her nothing, and the whole structure she had built in the last 48 hours would need to be rebuilt from a different angle. She reached for the nearest ledger. She began to work. She did not hear the second knock at the service entrance, the quiet, urgent knock that came at 8:20, 40 minutes before the courier was due, until Margaret was already in the doorway again with the look that meant something had moved. "Thomas Vey," Margaret said. Her voice was carefully controlled. "He's back." Saraphina looked up. "Ash didn't send the package through Ferris," Margaret said. He changed the delivery at the last minute. He's delivering it himself tonight. And he's not going to Callaway. She paused, and in the pause, Saraphina heard the specific quality of information that changes everything. The sound of a door opening onto a room larger and darker than the one you thought you were entering. He's going to Thornwall Palace, to Lady Ashcroft's private residence in the East Wing. The clock on the mantel read 8:23. Damian had left this room 31 minutes ago, headed back to Thornwall, where Pemberton Ash was currently walking through the same corridors with the original instruments to the Aldermere estates in his hands, going directly to the woman who had built the trap, to complete a transfer that would be done and documented before morning. And there was no contact, no courier shadow, no documented delivery chain to follow, because Ash had changed the plan, and the plan was now moving at a speed that 12 days and a formal court gathering could not catch. Saraphina stood up. She looked at the documents on the table, checked months of careful work, the patient architecture of proof, built piece by piece in the discipline her grandfather had taught her, the right way, the thorough way, the way that could not be contested. And she understood, in the cold and very clear light of 8:23 on a Thursday evening in late November, that she was out of time for the right way. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment and artistic purposes. All characters, events, and institutions depicted are entirely fictional and bear no resemblance to real persons or actual events. Saraphina was already moving before the thought fully formed. She crossed to the writing table, pulled the Callaway Fund documents and the timeline she had built into a single organized stack, and wrapped them in the leather folder she used for court correspondence, the kind that sealed flat and fit under an arm and did not announce itself. Her hands were steady. That was the thing she noticed about herself in moments like this. The way her hands stayed steady even when everything else was accelerating. It was the discipline her grandfather had built into her through years of negotiation in rooms where showing your hands meant losing, and she had internalized it so completely that her body simply did not betray her anymore, even when her mind was running at a speed that felt like controlled falling. "Get Callum," she said to Margaret. "Not a message. Go yourself. Go now. He can't be more than 20 minutes away if he took the Ardmore route home. Tell him Ash has changed the delivery and is going directly to Thornwall tonight. Tell him I need whatever contact he has at the Palace Registry Office to be ready to receive a filing before midnight." Margaret was already moving. "And Margaret," she looked up from the documents, "send for a carriage, fast horse, not the regular driver." Thomas Vey was still in the service entrance hall, cap in hand, watching her with the focused stillness of a man who understood he was standing at the edge of something he had put in motion and could not now stop. "You're going to Thornwall," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Ash will have arrived before you." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "What do you need me to do?" She stopped. She looked at him, at this young man who had carried private correspondence for 2 years without understanding what he was carrying, who had come to her service entrance tonight with the specific courage of someone who has decided that invisibility is no longer enough, that seeing a thing clearly creates an obligation to act on what you see. "Can you get back into the Chancellery tonight?" she said, "without being seen?" "The night clerk is Morse. He's been there 15 years and sleeps in the outer office after 10. The side entrance off the garden court is never locked. Ash's private correspondence files, the ones he keeps in his own office, not the general records room." Thomas did not flinch. He understood exactly what she was asking. "I know where they are. I need everything from the last 18 months, every copy he kept, every document he made in his own hand. I need it tonight." She held his gaze. "If Ash comes back tonight and finds those files disturbed, then I'm finished in that position regardless." He said it with the flat steadiness of someone who had already calculated the cost and accepted it. "I understood that when I knocked on your door this afternoon." She looked at him for one more second. Then she handed him a card from the writing table. Her own card, her name on one side, and on the other an address in the Harwick district. "When you have them, take them there. Tell them Lady Vale sent you. They will keep you safe until morning." He took the card, looked at it once, put it in his coat. Then he was gone, and Saraphina was pulling on her outer coat and picking up the leather folder, and the carriage that Margaret had sent for was already at the front. She could hear the horse on the cobblestones. and she went through the front door and into the cold night air of a city that did not know what was happening in its own corridors and did not need to, not yet. Thornwall Palace at night was a different structure than Thornwall Palace in the day. The formal facades went dark, and what remained was the working skeleton of the place. The servant corridors lit by wall sconces, the administrative wings where night clerks maintained the endless paperwork of governance, the residential east wing where the guest apartments of the court's most favored occupants stayed lit past midnight because the people who lived there kept hours that reflected their confidence in their own permanence. Saraphina had navigated Thornwall at night before. Her grandfather had brought her to formal evening gatherings from the time she was 16, and she had spent those evenings learning the palace the way she learned everything, by watching, by mapping, by understanding which corridors connected to which servant passages ran parallel to the formal halls, which night staff was amenable to reasonable requests from people who spoke to them with the directness of someone who understood that the people who kept a building running were not interchangeable with the building's furniture. She went through the east gate, which was managed after dark by a guard she did not know, and she gave her name and her reason. She was there to see the Duke of Blackthorn on a matter of estate urgency. And she waited the 2 minutes it took for the guard to send a message and receive confirmation, and then she was through. The east wing corridors were warm and quiet. Her footsteps on the stone floor were the only sound for 20 paces in either direction. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who belonged where she was walking, which was the first principle of moving through spaces where your presence was not officially expected. You walked like you had been sent for, not like you were arriving uninvited. And the difference in posture was the difference between being stopped and not. She found Damian in the corridor outside his private study on the second floor. He was standing with his hand on the study door, and he was not alone. His personal secretary, a young man named Trent, who Saraphina knew by sight, was beside him with the look of someone who had just delivered news that required a decision. Damian looked up when she appeared at the end of the corridor. The expression that moved through his face in the 2 seconds before he controlled it was the expression of a man who was simultaneously unsurprised and not ready. "You know," he said. "Ash is here," she said. "Not a question. He arrived 20 minutes ago. He told my secretary he was attending to an urgent estate matter." He looked at the study door, then back at her. "He went to the east residential corridor. Celeste Ashcroft's apartments." "How long ago?" she said. 15 minutes. He paused. "I was trying to determine the right move." She was already moving past him. He fell into step beside her without discussion, the way two people move together when they have arrived at the same decision from different directions and do not need to negotiate it. "The documents you need," he said, keeping his voice low as they moved down the corridor. "You don't have the physical instruments. If he completes the transfer tonight, I have the Callaway fund registration. I have the timeline. I have 18 months of correspondence patterns, and the 4th fund account linking to Ashcroft's solicitor." She did not slow down. "What I don't have is the transfer instrument itself, the document that ties Ash's action tonight to the fund, with his seal on it." She looked at him sideways. "What I need is to interrupt the transfer before he seals it. If the instrument is signed but not sealed, it is not legally complete." Damian absorbed this at pace. "And if it's already sealed?" "Then we are in a court challenge, not a registry filing. And court challenges take months and cost a great deal, and can be managed by people with resources to throw at the management of them." She did not elaborate on what that meant. He was smart enough to follow it. They reached the corridor that led to the east residential wing, and Damian stopped her with a hand on her arm. A brief contact, not restraining, just interrupting. "I go in first," he said. She looked at him. "He's my chancellor," Damian said. "In his own accounting of this, he's been managing my affairs. I walk in first, and that's the Duke walking in on his own employee. You walk in first." He paused, and she saw him work through what he was going to say. And it becomes something he can frame as interference, external influence. "The woman I dissolved an engagement with arriving at my chancellor's private meeting." It was correct. She had been calculating this herself and had arrived at the same structure and had been deciding whether to say it or wait for him to reach it. He had reached it. "You walk in first," she said. "I am 30 seconds behind you. Enough time for you to establish the scene, not enough time for him to redirect it." He nodded once. He walked. She counted to 30 and followed. Celeste Ashcroft's receiving room in the East Residential Wing was the kind of room that announced its occupants' ambitions through the specific quality of its furnishings. Not ostentatious, which would have been a mistake, but precisely calibrated, every object chosen to suggest establishment rather than aspiration, old money rather than new acquisition, as if the room had always looked this way and the woman in it had always belonged in it. Celeste was standing near the fireplace when Saraphina entered. Pemberton Ash was across the room at the writing desk, and his hand was flat on a document that Saraphina recognized from across the space. The deed format of the Aldermere title instruments, thick cream paper, the official seal block at the bottom right not yet pressed. Damian was standing in the center of the room, and the scene had clearly been running for less than a minute, because Ash had not yet managed his expression back to anything useful, and Celeste had. Celeste's expression was what it always was, controlled and warm and precisely calibrated. But her eyes, when they moved to the door and found Saraphina behind Damian, did something that the rest of her face did not do. A rapid, specific recalculation visible for approximately half a second before it was gone. "Lady Saraphina," Celeste said. Her voice was perfectly modulated. The surprise was managed so quickly it was almost not visible. "This is unexpected." "Lady Ashcroft." Saraphina did not elaborate. She looked at Ash. Ash looked back at her. He was a lean, gray-templed man with a face built for neutrality, and the neutrality was in place, but underneath it she could see the mechanism running. The rapid assessment of what she was doing here, what she knew, how much the situation had changed in the last 30 seconds. "Chancellor?" Damian said. His voice was quiet, the specific quiet of a man holding something very tightly. "What is that document?" Ash looked at Damian with the practiced steadiness of 7 years of professional proximity. "An estate matter, Your Grace. A restructuring arrangement I've been managing with Lady Ashcroft's investment advisors. It addresses the current credit situation in a way that—" "Stop!" Damian said it without raising his voice, and the word landed like something dropped from height. "What document? Specifically?" A pause. The fire cracked. "The Aldermere property instruments," Ash said. "A transfer arrangement to secure the outstanding credit obligations through a property collateral structure. It's a standard—" "It is not standard," Saraphina said from the doorway. She moved into the room, and she kept her voice at the same even register she always used, the voice of someone presenting a financial analysis rather than making an accusation, because the voice of someone presenting an analysis was harder to dismiss than the voice of someone making accusations. "A standard creditor protection arrangement requires the Duke's seal and signature. This arrangement uses only the Chancellery seal, which is possible because the Aldermere properties were registered under an administrative subclassification 40 years ago for tax purposes." She looked at Ash directly. "Someone with detailed knowledge of the Blackthorn Estate's legal structure would know that. Someone who had been reviewing those structures for 7 years would know exactly where that provision existed and how to use it." Ash's face did not change. That was the tell. A man hearing an incorrect accusation argues. A man hearing a correct one calculates. "Lady Vale," he said, with the measured tone of someone deploying professional distance like a shield, "I understand you have certain perspectives on the Duke's estate management, given your prior arrangement with the family, but these matters are—" "The Callaway Fund," she said. The 3 words in the room. She watched Ash's face the way she watched markets. Not for the dramatic signal, but for the small one, the fractional movement that happened before the control reasserted. There it was. A tightening around the eyes, a single breath held a half-second longer than natural. "The Callaway Fund holds positions in all 3 of the Blackthorn creditors currently calling notes against the estate," she continued. "The fund was registered 18 months ago. Its account of correspondence is managed through a solicitor's office on Terrace Street in the Callaway Financial District." She looked at Celeste. "The same solicitor's office that holds account of record for several of Lady Ashcroft's personal investment holdings." The room was very still. Celeste looked at her with the expression of a woman who had prepared for many contingencies and was deciding which preparation to deploy. "Investment accounts share legal representatives all the time," she said. Her voice was easy, slightly amused, the tone of someone who finds an accusation beneath serious engagement. The suggestion that a shared solicitor constitutes a conspiracy is the fund's initial capitalization, Saraphina said, included a transfer from an account registered to Harwick Maritime Holdings, which is a nominee entity that your solicitor's office established 6 years ago in conjunction with your family's trading interests in the southern ports. She opened the leather folder. She set the documents on the nearest flat surface, which was the side table near the door, and she turned them so that the relevant portions faced outward. That is not a shared solicitor. That is capital flow. Documented capital flow with dates and account numbers and transfer references that appear in the Harwick Financial Registry records, which are public instruments. Celeste's expression did something subtle. The warmth went out of it, not dramatically, but the way a fire goes out when the fuel runs low, gradually, and then all at once. "Damian," she said. She turned to him, and her voice changed register, softer, more direct. The specific intimacy of someone appealing to a private relationship, using the first name like a key. "Whatever Lady Vale has assembled, you know I have been working to support your interests. Tell me how you knew about the Vansons' contract," Damian said. She stopped. "The specific provisions," he said. "The reason Vansons couldn't absorb the Callaway fee restructuring was a clause in their operating agreement that capped their fee pass-through to clients at a fixed percentage. It's an obscure clause. It's not in the public summary of the contract. I know it because Ash briefed me on it when we signed." He looked at her with the stillness that had replaced the weariness somewhere in the last 10 minutes, the stillness of a man who has stopped being tired and started being something harder. "3 months before the Callaway fees changed, you mentioned that contract clause to me. At dinner, you referenced it specifically in the context of how exposed I was to the Eastern route." He paused. "I thought you were demonstrating financial acumen. I was impressed by it." Another pause. "I know now that I shouldn't have been impressed. I should have asked how you knew." The fire in the grate. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that was not the calculated warmth, and was not the brief recalculation from before. Something older and less managed, a flash of something that might have been, in a different person, in a different situation, respect. "You're smarter than I planned for," she said, quietly, without performance. The admission dropped into the room with the specific weight of things said because there is no longer any point in not saying them. Ash moved. Not toward the door. He understood the door was not viable, but toward the writing desk, toward the document, and Saraphina understood what he was doing before he completed the movement. If the instrument was sealed and dated tonight, even a contested transfer created a legal entanglement that took months to resolve, and months of entanglement served someone who needed time to move assets and establish alternative positions. "Don't," Damian said. Ash stopped. He stood with his hand near the document and looked at Damian, and Saraphina watched the 7 years between them move through Ash's face. Not remorse, nothing as simple as remorse, but the specific gravity of a man who had made a choice years ago and had been living inside that choice ever since and was now standing at the end of it. "You were good to me," Ash said. It sounded genuine, and perhaps it was. "The arrangement was already in place before I came to this house. Lady Ashcroft's network recruited me before Lord Hartwell recommended me to you." He paused. "I want you to understand that the recommendation was not fabricated. Lord Hartwell's commendation was genuine. But the decision to seek that position, that was directed." The room held that. 7 years, Damian said. The 2 words carried everything they needed to carry. He did not expand on them. Ash looked at the document. He looked at Damian. He stepped back from the desk. Saraphina crossed to the desk in 4 steps, picked up the Aldermere instruments, and held them without looking at them, keeping her eyes on the room. "I'm filing an emergency injunction with the Palace Registry Office tonight," she said. "The Callaway Fund documentation, the capital flow records from Harwick Maritime Holdings, and the account correspondence patterns constitute sufficient grounds to freeze the fund's positions pending investigation." She looked at Celeste. "The registry office will notify the High Court clerk before morning. The formal gathering of the High Houses is in 11 days. Celeste looked at her with the expression she had now fully dropped the management of, not angry, not afraid, something more precise than either. The look of a woman who had been building something for years and was watching it come apart and was deciding, in real time, whether she had a move left. "You understand," Celeste said, "that I have relationships in this court that go considerably deeper than one evening's evidence. People who have benefited from my network's arrangements, who will not welcome a public—" "I know exactly who they are," Saraphina said. "I have managed financial relationships with most of them for longer than you've been attending this court." She held Celeste's gaze. "They will make their calculations. They generally do." A silence, longer than the others. Then Celeste said, with the specific flatness of a woman removing the last performance from her voice, "What do you want?" "Tonight? Nothing from you." Saraphina picked up the leather folder. She placed the Aldermere instruments inside it with the other documents, carefully, without haste. "In 11 days, I want you to stand in the gathering hall and hear what the documents say, and I want the people in that room to hear it at the same time." She looked at Celeste directly. "What happens after that is the court's business, not mine." She turned to Damian. He was looking at her with an expression she did not have a ready category for. Not gratitude, which would have been insufficient for what had happened in the last 40 minutes. Not the complicated thing from earlier in the evening either. Something that was assembling itself in real time into a shape she would have to look at later, when there was time to look at things. "The registry office," she said. We need to go now." He nodded. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back. Not at Celeste, not at Ash, but at the room itself. The calibrated furnishings, the fireplace, the writing desk where the document had been waiting for a seal that had not been pressed. The room that had been the operational center of a plan 18 months in the making, constructed with the patience and precision of someone who understood that real power moved slowly and quietly and arrived disguised as coincidence. She understood that better than most. She walked out. Anasin. The palace registry office was on the ground floor of the administrative north wing, and the night clerk was a thin, precise man named Aldous, who had worked the night shift for 11 years and had the particular unhurried competence of someone who understood that the documents that arrived after dark were frequently the most consequential ones. He looked at what Saraphina placed before him without expression. He looked at the capital flow records, the fund registration dates, the account correspondence patterns. He looked at the Aldermere instruments with the technical attention of a man who understood deed structures. He looked at Damian. "Your Grace, you're authorizing this filing." "I am," Damian said. Aldous began the paperwork. Saraphina stood at the counter and felt, for the first time since 8:23, the specific deceleration of a situation that had been moving at a speed her body had been managing, rather than feeling. Her hands were steady. Her voice, the few times she spoke to clarify a document reference for Aldous, was level. But underneath the steadiness, in the place where her body kept the actual accounting of what things cost, she registered the weight of the last 4 hours. The cold carriage ride, the palace corridors, the room with the fireplace and the document on the desk, and Celeste's voice dropping the last layer of management from it. "What do you want?" She had known the answer. She had known it before Celeste asked. She had known it, probably, since she stood in the corridor outside Thornwall's great hall 6 months ago and pressed her fingers to the cold stone windowsill and breathed once slowly and went back to work. Not destruction. Not the satisfaction of watching the architecture of a plan collapse on its architect, though she was not so disciplined that she had felt nothing in that room tonight. Something simpler and harder to name. The specific thing her grandfather had called the true purpose of the work. The reason you built what you built and protected what you protected. Not the accumulation of power for its own sake, but the ability to determine at the moments that mattered what actually happened. The ability to be the person who decided what the documents said and where they went and what they meant. Aldous stamped the filing and handed her the registry copy. She looked at the stamp. The date, the registry number, the clerk's initials, proof of existence. The document had arrived and been received and was now part of the official record of the palace, and whatever Celeste's relationships in the court were, whatever Ash's next move was, this could not be unfiled. She exhaled. Damian was beside her at the counter, and she became aware that he had been watching her for several seconds without speaking. She looked up at him. "It holds until the gathering," she said. The injunction freezes the fund's positions. Ash cannot complete the transfer, but the evidence I have is enough to present, not enough to make uncontestable. Celeste's legal resources will attempt to complicate the timeline, argue the capital flow records are circumstantial, challenge the registry filing on procedural grounds. She held the folder. In 11 days, I need to walk into that hall with something they cannot complicate. I need the full picture, every connection documented, every date established, the kind of record that does not leave room for procedural challenge. 11 days, he said. I have most of it. Thomas Vey is pulling Ash's private correspondence files tonight. That gives me the originating instructions, the record of what Ash actually sent and when. With that, she stopped. Something in her chest registered the fatigue, not dramatically, just the honest account of a body that had been running at a speed that was not sustainable and knew it. With that, we have the complete chain. Damian looked at her in the registry office's spare, practical light, the light of working hours, not the chandelier gold of the court, the kind of light that showed things as they were rather than as they were presented. You should have been nowhere near that room tonight, he said. If Ash had moved differently, if Celeste had had someone— I made the assessment, she said. The risk was acceptable given the alternative. The alternative was losing the Aldermere properties. The alternative was losing 11 days and the ability to control how the evidence was presented. She looked at him. Those were not equivalent. He was quiet for a moment. You calculated a risk on my behalf that you had every reason not to take. She looked at the registry stamp on the filing document. I calculated a risk on behalf of a situation that required someone to calculate it. She set the folder down on the counter for a moment, an uncharacteristic movement, the brief setting down of something heavy. You came to my study on Tuesday and apologized to me without knowing whether I would hear it or help you or have you removed from the premises. You came alone, and you said it plainly, and then you asked directly for what you needed. She looked at him. That is not nothing. In my experience of the way men conduct themselves when they need something, that is actually quite rare. He looked at her with the expression that had been assembling itself in Celeste's receiving room, the one she had put aside for later. She looked back at it now in the registry office light, without the pressure of a room requiring management, and she saw what it was. It was a man looking at something he had discarded without understanding its value, and understanding now, precisely and without defense, what that had cost him. The clock on the registry wall read 11:47. The gathering is in 11 days, she said. She picked up the folder. I have work to do. So do I, he said. She turned toward the door, stopped. You're a groundskeeper in the Aldermere Valley, she said. Thomas Vey's father. Damian's expression shifted with the surprise of a man encountering an angle he had not tracked. Clem Vey. He's been on the property 30 years. His son came to my service entrance this evening because he was afraid of what would happen to his father if those properties transferred. She looked at Damian steadily. I want you to remember that. When you review the staff situation in your chancellery, when you work through the consequences of tonight, I want you to remember that the person who set this in motion tonight was a 22-year-old clerk who decided that carrying the correspondence was not the same as being complicit in it and acted on that distinction at significant personal cost. Damian held her gaze. I'll remember it, he said. She looked at him for one more moment. This man who had walked into her study 4 days ago stripped of the scaffolding and had been walking, since then, with the specific unsteadiness of someone learning to move differently, and had walked into Celeste Ashcroft's receiving room 40 minutes ago and held his ground in the exact way she had needed him to hold it. Then she walked out of the registry office, into the cold administrative corridor, carrying 11 days of work and a filing stamp, and the distinct awareness that what happened in the gathering hall in 11 days would be determined not by what she did in this corridor tonight, but by what she built in the quiet hours between now and then. The same way it was always determined, the way it had always been determined, in the work that happened before the visible moment, in the invisible architecture that nobody saw until the surface gave way and revealed what had been holding it up all along. She was 3 corridors from the east gate when her carriage driver's face appeared at the end of the hall, sent to find her, and behind him, moving quickly, was Margaret. Margaret, who had sent Callum and sent the carriage and gone out into the dark city on foot herself, to manage the pieces of a situation that had been moving faster than any of them had planned for. Margaret looked at her, looked at the folder, looked at her face. "The filing went through," Saraphina said. Margaret breathed out. "And Ash is in the East Wing, with no document to seal and a great deal to consider." She walked past her toward the gate. "Come, we have 11 days. What she did not say, what she kept, for the moment, in the careful accounting she maintained of things that were real but not yet time to name, was what she had seen in Damian's face in the registry office light. What she had felt when he said, "So do I," and meant it the way people mean things when they have stopped performing and started actually meaning them. She had spent 3 years building something quiet and real with a man who had not known it was there. She had spent 6 months putting it down without ceremony. She had spent 4 days in a situation that had required her to be entirely the version of herself that her grandfather had built, the version that moved through crises with steady hands and did not make things visible and never showed the cost of things until it was safe to show them. The East Gate opened onto the cold night city. 11 days. She walked through. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment and artistic purposes. All characters, events, and institutions depicted are entirely fictional and bear no resemblance to real persons or actual events. Part 8. The 11 days passed the way the hardest work always passed. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the specific density of time that is being used completely. Every hour accounted for. Every morning beginning before the light came, and every evening ending after it had gone. Saraphina did not sleep more than 4 hours on any of those nights. She did not note this as a hardship. She noted it the way she noted everything, accurately, without sentiment, in the column of costs that every significant undertaking carried, and that you paid without complaint because the alternative was not undertaking the thing, and not undertaking the thing was not a position she recognized as available. Thomas Vey had delivered Ash's private correspondence files to the Harwick address before dawn on the Friday morning, and what those files contained was the complete architecture of 18 months of deliberate betrayal, laid out in Ash's own precise hand. The letters to the Callaway solicitor, the account summaries copied and transmitted, the specific timing instructions that coordinated the creditor call sequence with the Vanson's suspension. The files did not contain Celeste Ashcroft's name directly. Ash had been careful about that, careful in the way of a man who understood his own exposure and had kept one layer of separation between himself and the woman directing the operation. But the Capital Flow records from Harwick Maritime Holdings were not careful. Capital Flow left traces in registry documents and transfer records and banking correspondence that did not care about the intentions of the people generating them. And Saraphina had spent 8 of the 11 days pulling those traces out of the public record and laying them in sequence until the chain was complete. From Celeste's family trading interest through the nominee entity, through the Callaway Fund's initial capitalization, through the coordinated positions in the Blackthorn creditors, dated and referenced and cross-checked against Ash's correspondence timeline, until the two narratives locked together into a single documented account that said, plainly and completely and without room for procedural challenge, what had been done and by whom and when. She presented the completed record to Master Callum on the 9th day. He read it for an hour without speaking. Then he looked up and said, "This would hold in any financial court in the kingdom." "It needs to hold in a social one," she said, "in 11 days. "It'll hold there too," he said. "The question is whether the people in that room will let it." She knew what he meant. She had been thinking about it since the registry office, since she had walked out of Thornwall into the cold city with 11 days ahead of her, and a clear understanding that what she was building was not just a legal document, but a public event. And public events in the gathering hall of Thornwall Palace were not determined purely by the quality of the evidence. They were determined by who was in the room and what those people needed to believe, and what the cost of believing it was. Celeste Ashcroft had been at court for 4 seasons. She had been, in those 4 seasons, precisely what she had been designed to present: charming, well-resourced, apparently well-connected, the kind of woman who made people feel that knowing her was an advantage. She had cultivated relationships with the specific patience of a long-term operation, and those relationships were real, in the sense that the people who held them had real benefits they did not want to lose. Saraphina knew all of this. She had known it before she walked into the registry office. She had built the document record anyway, because the document record was the only thing she knew how to build, and because she had been taught, in her grandfather's study over 20 years of formation, that the truth documented was the only form of truth that survived the people who wanted to contest it. She trusted the work. She had always trusted the work. She did not trust the room. The morning of the quarterly gathering came in clear and cold, a winter sky that had burned off its clouds overnight and left the city under pale blue light that showed everything without warmth. Saraphina dressed without ornamentation. The gown was deep green, a color she had chosen because it was not the water blue of the day at Thornwall 6 months ago, and was not an attempt to signal anything except presence. She wore her grandfather's pin at the collar, a small thing, plain silver, the only piece of jewelry she ever wore in formal settings. She had worn it the day she sat with the lawyers after his death and understood the full scope of what he had left her and what she was going to do with it. She wore it today for the same reason she had worn it then, not for luck, but as the reminder of the specific obligation she carried, the one he had built into her over decades, to do the work, and do it right, and not look away from what it cost. Margaret helped her with the final arrangements in silence, the two of them moving through the familiar morning preparation with the economy of long practice. At the door, Margaret handed her the leather folder with the assembled documents inside. "Everything is in order?" Margaret said. "I know." She took the folder. Margaret held her gaze for a moment. "You've done this before," she said. "Different rooms, different stakes. You've done it before." "I know that too," Saraphina said. She went out. Thornwall Palace's great hall held the quarterly gathering the way it always held it, with the chandeliers lit against the winter light coming through the high windows. The 300 bodies of the court arranged in the specific social geometries that reproduce themselves season after season, the surface of civilized governance performing its ongoing theater while the actual work of power moved underneath it in channels that the theater was designed to obscure. Saraphina arrived early. She took a position not at the edge of the room, as she had 6 months ago, but near the center, close to the formal presentation floor where the gathering's official business was conducted. She set the leather folder on the table beside her. She waited. Damian arrived 20 minutes later, and he arrived differently than she had ever seen him arrive. Not with the unhurried certainty of entitlement, not with the performance of a man who had never needed to calculate his welcome, but with the deliberate attention of someone who had decided what he was doing and had come to do it. He was dressed formally, the blackthorn colors, the full Duke's presentation. He looked, she thought, like a man who had put on his armor understanding for the first time what armor was actually for. Not display, but protection. Not the announcement of power, but the preparation for the cost of exercising it. He found her across the room and held her gaze for a moment. She gave him a brief nod. He moved to his household's position. Celeste entered 10 minutes after that, on the arm of Lord Crane, who had apparently decided that proximity to her was still advantageous until events proved otherwise. She was dressed in ivory and gold, immaculate, composed, the performance intact and operating at full capacity. She did not look at Saraphina. The deliberateness of not looking was visible. Ash was not present. He had sent word the previous day, through his household, that he was indisposed. Saraphina had expected this. A man who understood the shape of what was coming and could not run far enough to matter had two available responses, presence and defiance, or absence and the waiting. Ash had chosen absence. It was the calculation of a man who still believed on some level that the situation might be contained. It would not be contained. The gathering's formal proceedings began at 10 o'clock, the standard business of the quarterly session, estate reports, trade summaries, the administrative maintenance of a kingdom's ongoing operations. Saraphina sat through it with the patience of someone who understood that the timing of a presentation was part of its content, that moving too early created a different event than moving at the right moment, and the right moment was not when she was ready, but when the room was. The right moment came an hour into the proceedings, when the session moved to the open floor for matters of estate concern, which was the traditional format for addressing disputes and claims that required the court's witness. She stood up. The room registered it the way rooms registered her standing up. With a moment of recalibration, the attention of people who had known her as a peripheral figure suddenly reorienting towards someone who had chosen to occupy the center. "Lady Vale," the session moderator said with the practiced neutrality of a man who had managed difficult quarterly gatherings before and was already assessing this one, "you have a matter to bring before the court." "I do," she said. Her voice carried without effort, the way it always carried, not because she projected it, but because she had learned to speak from a place of settled attention that required no performance to reach the back of a room. "I am presenting a formal record of financial fraud perpetrated against the Blackthorn estate over a period of 18 months, through the coordinated manipulation of the estate's internal financial management and the deliberate engineering of the credit conditions that have threatened the estate's stability this past quarter." The room did not go silent. It went to that particular frequency of sustained noise that was actually a form of silence. The noise of 300 people processing something and not yet knowing what to do with the processing. She opened the leather folder. She began. She did not tell the story dramatically. She did not use the language of accusation or the rhetoric of outrage. She presented the documents the way she presented financial analyses. In sequence, each piece connected to the next by documented relationship. The capital flow records followed by the fund registration, followed by the correspondence timeline, followed by the creditor coordination evidence. Every date established, every transfer referenced. The chain of connection laid out in the plain language of financial record keeping that did not require interpretation because it was designed to be unambiguous. It took 34 minutes. She did not look at Celeste during most of it. She looked at the documents and at the moderator and at the room generally, the way you look at an audience you are informing rather than an adversary you are defeating, because the distinction mattered. She was not here to destroy Celeste Ashcroft. She was here to put the truth into the record of this court. And those were not the same thing, and the difference between them was the difference between justice and performance. When she set down the final document, the room was doing something she had not entirely anticipated. It was not the resistant silence of a court protecting its own. It was the specific quiet of people who have been presented with something they cannot contest and are working through the implications of that. Lord Crane had moved, at some point in the last 34 minutes, 3 feet away from Celeste Ashcroft. Celeste was standing very still in her ivory and gold. Her face was composed. Her hands were not quite still. A very small movement at the edge of the left hand, barely visible, the only external evidence of what 34 minutes of documented public exposure felt like from the inside. The moderator looked at the documents. He looked at Celeste. "Lady Ashcroft, do you wish to respond to this record?" Celeste looked at the room. She looked at the 300 faces that were looking back at her with the various expressions of people recalibrating their social calculations in real time. She looked at Lord Crane, who was now examining the middle distance with dedicated attention. She looked at Saraphina. It was a long look, longer than anything else in the morning. And in it, Saraphina saw the same thing she had seen briefly in the receiving room 11 days ago. The flash of something under the management, something that might have been, in a different life, genuine. The recognition of one capable woman by another, the specific acknowledgement of craft, the understanding that the person who had undone you had done it with the same tools you had used to build what you were building, and had simply used them better. "I have nothing to respond with," Celeste said. Her voice was level, clean. "The record speaks." 3 words of acknowledgement that were not a confession in legal terms, and were not required to be because the documents were the confession, and everyone in the room had just read them. And what Celeste Ashcroft understood, standing in her ivory and gold before 300 people who were quietly revising their understanding of who she was that there was no move left that changed what had happened. She walked out of the hall, not hurriedly, with the same composed bearing she had always carried, the posture of a woman who would not give a room the satisfaction of seeing her diminished in her own body. Whatever she was not that. Saraphina watched her go. She felt nothing simple about it. The woman who had engineered 18 months of deliberate harm had just been publicly undone, and the undoing was real and necessary and right. And it was also the ending of something that Saraphina was honest enough to acknowledge had been, in its own way, formidable. You could despise the use a capability was put to, and still recognize the capability. Her grandfather had taught her that too. The formal proceedings reconvened an hour later, after the necessary administrative response to the morning's events. The referral of the documentation to the kingdom's financial oversight authority, the formal notation in the court record, the moderator's careful language that acknowledged the evidence without prejudging the legal process that would follow. Saraphina sat through the reconvened session and said nothing further. She had said what she came to say. The rest was the court's business, as she had told Celeste 11 days ago, and she had meant it. Damian found her afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, in almost exactly the position where she had stood 6 months ago. The same window looking out over the eastern courtyard, the same winter light. He came alone. He stood beside her and looked out at the courtyard without speaking for a moment. "It's done," he said finally. "The legal process isn't done," she said. "The financial authority review will take months. There will be challenges to the fund's positions. Ash will cooperate or he won't, and his cooperation will determine how much of the network gets fully documented." She paused. "But what needed to happen in that room today has happened." He was quiet for a moment. "The Aldermere properties are in the Blackthorn vault, where they belong. The injunction holds until the review is complete." He nodded. He looked out the window at the courtyard where, 6 months ago, a groom had walked a gray horse in slow circles through the frost, while she had stood at this window and pressed her fingers to cold stone and decided to go back to work. The courtyard was empty now. The frost was gone. Winter had deepened past the point of morning frost into the kind of cold that simply sat, permanent and uncommitted to change. "I have been trying," Damian said slowly, "to understand something about myself. About who I was 6 months ago, in that hall." He stopped. He looked at his hands, briefly, then out the window again. "I did not know you," he said. 3 years of engagement, letters, evenings in my library, and I did not know you. I knew the surface of you. I knew the composed face and the careful voice and the intelligence I could see but did not understand the scope of." He paused. "I mistook your silence for absence. I thought what I couldn't see wasn't there." She looked at him. She did not fill the silence. "That is the thing I have been sitting with," he said. "Not the shame of having been manipulated by Celeste. That is painful, but it is a thing that happened to me, and I can work through a thing that happened to me. The thing I can't work through as quickly is the understanding of what I chose to discard, what I looked at and did not see." He turned to face her. "That was not done to me. That was me." It was the most honest thing she had heard a powerful man say in a very long time. Not the apology of Tuesday, that had been genuine, but still somewhat in the mode of a man managing a situation. This was something underneath the management, the specific reckoning of a man who had stopped looking for the mitigating factor and started looking at the thing itself. "You saw it eventually," she said, "when it mattered. Because you came to the registry office," he said, "because you took a risk on my behalf that—" "I made a calculation," she said. "I told you that at the time." "You told me a version of that," he said. "I'm not certain it was the complete version." She looked at him. The winter light was the same light it always was. Thin, uncommitted, showing things plainly without the generosity of warmth. "No," she said. "It wasn't the complete version." The admission sat between them in the corridor, quiet and unelaborated, and she let it sit there without reaching for the management of it, because she had decided, somewhere in the 11 days of work and the 34 minutes of the presentation and the walk out of the east gate into the cold city, that there were costs she had been carrying in the column of things not said that needed to be moved to the column of things said, and this was one of them. Damian looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Not for the estate, not for the legal process. From me." She thought about the question. She thought about it the way she thought about things that required actual thinking. Not the rapid calculation of financial structures, but the slower, less certain consideration of things that did not have documentary evidence and registry stamps to anchor them. "Time," she said finally. "The right kind of time, not urgency, not the pressure of a situation that requires something from both of us." She looked at him directly. We have spent 4 days in a crisis together, and I know what you are capable of when there is no other option. That is useful information, but it is not sufficient." She paused. "I want to know who you are when there is another option, when the crisis is over and the choice is genuinely free." He held her gaze. "That's a fair demand." "It's not a demand," she said. "It's what I need. Those are also different things." Something shifted in his expression, the same thing she had seen in the registry office, but settled now, less raw, the shape of it clearer. A man who had been stripped of what he thought he was, and was in the process of finding out what was underneath, and was discovering that what was underneath was more durable than what had been removed. "Then that's what I'll give you," he said. "Time. The right kind." She looked out at the courtyard one more time. The empty courtyard, the winter light, the same window where 6 months ago she had breathed once slowly and decided to go back to work. "The Harwick district," she said. "There's a coffee house on the canal side, near the Maritime Factors Guild. It opens at 7 in the morning. I go there on Fridays when the week's correspondence is done." She did not look at him. "The coffee is better than anything in the court quarter." A beat. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she said. She picked up the leather folder from where it had been resting against the wall. She looked at it for a moment. The document record of 18 months of work, the assembled evidence of a plan that had tried to use her removal to complete itself, and had failed, in part because the person it had removed had continued to exist and to work and to see things clearly in the long months of being invisible. She tucked it under her arm. "Go look after your estate, Your Grace," she said. "There's significant work ahead of it." "I know," he said. "I've got a better understanding now of what that work actually requires." She walked down the corridor. Her footsteps were the same footsteps they had always been, measured, unhurried, the walk of a woman who had somewhere to be and would arrive there in her own time. The chandeliers above the hall threw their light through the archway into the corridor, gold and generous, and she moved through it and out the other side into the quieter passages of the palace's working wing, where the paperwork of governance continued its patient accumulation, and the night clerks filed their documents, and the registry stamped its records, and the work went on. She went out through the east gate, into the city, Wonk. The kingdom's financial review of the Callaway Fund took 4 months. Pemberton Ash cooperated in the end with the completeness of a man who had made his calculation and determined that cooperation was the remaining viable option. The fund was dissolved, its positions liquidated, its connections to Celeste Ashcroft's investment holdings fully documented in the official record. Lady Celeste Ashcroft withdrew from court life before the review was complete. She did not return. The Blackthorn estate recovered. Not immediately. The Eastern contract situation required the full negotiation season to resolve, and the credit arrangements took 2 quarters to restructure into stability. But it recovered, and in recovering it was rebuilt on a foundation that Damian understood now in a way he had not understood it before. Not as an inheritance to be managed by trusted intermediaries while he occupied himself with the visible aspects of his position, but as a living system of relationships and obligations that required his actual attention and his actual presence. He gave it that. He was in the Aldermere Valley when the spring planting began, which was the first time a Blackthorn Duke had been present for planting in 40 years, and Clem Vey, Thomas Vey's father, showed him the Northfield's drainage problem that had been quietly costing the estate yield for a decade, and Damian stood in the mud and looked at it and did not delegate the looking. Thomas Vey became his personal secretary 6 months after the quarterly gathering. It was not a reward exactly, Saraphina would have said, and did say when Damian told her that it was simply the accurate placement of a capable person, which was the most reliable form of institutional intelligence that existed and the most consistently underutilized. Damian agreed with her, and did not bother to observe that 3 years ago he would have considered such a placement beneath his attention, because that man was not someone he needed to defend or explain. He had been that man. He was something else now. The distance between the two was not the currency he traded in anymore. The coffee house on the canal side near the Maritime Factors Guild became, over the months that followed the gathering, the place where 2 people discovered who each other actually were, not in crisis, not in the managed formality of arranged engagement, but in the ordinary Friday mornings of a city going about its business. 2 cups of coffee on a canal-side table, conversation that went where it went without agenda. What they built in those Friday mornings was not romantic in the conventional sense, not the dramatic declaration or the swept-up certainty of people who have convinced themselves that intensity is the same as truth. It was quieter than that and more durable, and built on a foundation that neither of them would have been capable of building 6 months earlier. Damian because he had not yet understood what things were worth, Saraphina because she had not yet been willing to let the worth of things be visible to someone who might again choose not to see it. She became willing, slowly, in the way that careful people become willing to things. Not all at once, not with the decision made in advance, but incrementally, each small act of visibility testing the ground before the next one. The way you crossed uncertain terrain, not by deciding it was safe, but by finding each step solid before trusting your weight to it. He held. That was the thing she discovered, Friday by Friday, in the canal-side coffee house with the winter giving way to a slow, uncertain spring. He held in the way that mattered, not perfectly, not without the occasional friction of two very different kinds of intelligence negotiating the same territory, but with the consistent underlying seriousness of a man who had decided what he was doing and was doing it without looking for an exit. A year after the quarterly gathering, the kingdom's northern trade routes were restructured under a cooperative agreement between the Blackthorn Estates merchant relationships and the Vale Network's maritime factors connections, an arrangement that reduced shipping costs across 15 major trading corridors and generated increased revenue for both the noble houses and the merchant guild members who supplied the volume. It was not announced as a partnership between Saraphina Vale and Damian Blackthorn specifically. It was announced, in the plain language of trade documents, as a restructuring of the Northern Maritime Corridor's operational framework. The people who understood what they were looking at understood what they were looking at. Master Callum, reviewing the agreement in his office at the Maritime Factors Guild, read it twice and then set it down and allowed himself briefly the expression of a man who has watched something he hoped for come to pass without the benefit of certainty that it would. Then he picked it up again and began making notes, because the work did not stop for satisfaction, and he was his own kind of person who understood that. On a Friday morning in late autumn, a year and 2 months after the day that had begun with frost on the palace courtyard and ended with an apology in a corridor, Saraphina sat at the canal-side table in the coffee house near the Maritime Factors Guild and looked out at the water. The canal moved the way it always moved, with the unhurried purpose of water that knows where it is going and does not require anyone to approve the direction. The autumn light was low and gold, the kind that came in at an angle and made ordinary things look considered, as if the light itself were making an argument for the value of what it touched. Damian was across the table. He had a document he wanted to show her, something about the Aldermere Valley's eastern boundary and an adjacent landholding whose owner was interested in a cooperative farming arrangement, and he was explaining the structure of it with the focused attention he now brought to these conversations. The attention of a man who had learned that the details were not beneath him, but were in fact where the actual substance of things lived. She listened. She asked 2 questions that reoriented his thinking on the boundary clause, which he acknowledged with the direct acknowledgement of someone who had stopped finding it difficult to be corrected by someone smarter than him about a specific thing, because he understood now that that was not a diminishment, but an advantage, and the distinction between those 2 experiences of the same event was one of the things that defined the man he was becoming. Outside, the canal moved under the autumn light. The city went about its Friday business, the market voices from the next street, the sound of the harbor quarter 2 blocks east, the ordinary productive noise of a place that worked. Saraphina looked at the water for a moment. She thought about her grandfather, the way she thought about him most Fridays in this place, not with grief anymore, but with the specific gratitude of a person who understands, at a sufficient distance, the weight of what they were given. He had given her the tools and the discipline and the particular view of the world that understood power as something that flowed through invisible channels and was built in silence and belonged to whoever was willing to do the work that nobody watched. He had not known who she would use it with. He had not needed to know. He had trusted the formation. She thought about the morning at Thornwall 6 months into the worst year, the great hall, the chandeliers, the 300 faces, The specific quality of silence after she had said, "I believe you understand that engagements of this nature serve strategic purposes." She thought about walking out through the heavy oak doors and finding the window and pressing her fingers to cold stone and breathing once and deciding, without drama, to go back to work. She had gone back to work. She had kept going back to work every morning of the 6 months that followed, and the work had done what the work always did when you trusted it. It had moved incrementally, invisibly, through the channels it understood, and it had arrived in its own time at the truth. Damian finished explaining the Aldermere boundary situation. He looked at her across the table with the look she had come to know, not the managed attention of the man who had walked into that hall 6 months ago with Celeste Ashcroft on his arm, but the actual attention of a man present in a specific moment with a specific person and understanding the value of both. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked at the canal. "That the Eastern Boundary Clause needs to be reviewed by someone who understands the cooperative farming provisions in the Northern Territorial Code," she said. "I know someone at the Harwick District Land Registry who specializes in that area." She looked back at him. "I'll introduce you." He looked at her for a moment. The autumn light came in at its low gold angle and fell across the table between them, across the document, and the 2 coffee cups, and the ordinary Friday morning of 2 people who had earned, through separate and difficult routes, the particular ground they were standing on. "All right," he said. It was the same word he had said in her study more than a year ago, sitting across the writing table with the posture of a man who had run out of alternatives and was making a decision he understood was real. He said it the same way now, simply, without performance. But it meant something different, because the man saying it was different, and what he was saying it to was different. And the distance between what it had meant then and what it meant now was the distance a person traveled when they were willing to look clearly at their own damage and move through it rather than around it. The canal moved. The light held. The city continued its Friday. Saraphina picked up her coffee. She looked out at the water one more time, at the ordinary, beautiful fact of it, the unglamorous working canal of a working city doing what it did with no awareness of being watched or evaluated or required to be more than what it was. She understood that. She had always understood it. The most essential work happened without an audience, without announcement, in the long, unremarkable hours when nobody was watching and the thing got built anyway, piece by piece, in the discipline and the silence, in the patient accumulation of days that did not feel significant until, from a sufficient distance, you could see what they had made. She set down her cup. She looked at Damian across the table. "Friday next," she said. "Bring the full Aldermere boundary file. We'll go through the Eastern Clause properly." He almost smiled. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she said. Outside, the kingdom went about its work. Inside, 2 people who had found each other by the long route, the only route that produces anything durable, sat at a canal-side table in the autumn light and continued the quiet, ordinary, essential business of building something real.